Hello and welcome to this course entitled EPA Spill Prevention Control and Countermeasure Rule, Moving Beyond Bewilderment. I'm Doug Dean, your instructor, and I'm happy you're here. Perhaps you are interested in this topic because you recently were told that your facility is required to develop an SPCC plan and you wonder why. Or maybe you joined a company and as part of your responsibility, you sort of inherited an SPCC plan, but you have no idea as to why the plan exists in the first place. Determining why an SPCC plan is required by EPA can be a bewildering task. However, it only makes sense that if you are asked to put forth the effort of implementing an SPCC plan, that you have a clear understanding as to why that plan is needed. This is the intent of this course, to help you understand how an SPCC rule applies, and it's hoped that such knowledge will reinforce your motivation for effectively implementing it. By doing so, you will help ensure that the plan meets SPCC's intended goal, protection of our nation's precious water resources. So let's begin.
This video is the first of a three-part series that will explain the SPCC rule and its requirements. This part 1 will try to help answer the question, does the SPCC rule apply to my facility? Why is this an important question? Because SPCC applicability at first glance seems straightforward and can even be summarized in one sentence. However, this is misleading, because a sentence like that is chock full of terms and concepts that must be properly understood to make an accurate judgment of applicability. Therefore, the focus of this part 1 is to explain these important terms and concepts. Once it's determined that the SPCC rule applies, it's then important to know that there are options for what type of SPCC plan can satisfy the requirements. Part 2 covers this subject in detail. Knowing the qualifying criteria EPA uses for each plan can help the facility owner make the right choice for a plan. Making the wrong choice can potentially cost the facility owner a lot of extra time and money. Part 3 covers the SPCC requirements for oil spill prevention and response. These requirements are straightforward and make a lot of sense, at least compared to the confusion associated with determining SPCC applicability. EPA has also put flexibility in the rule to allow facility owners to tailor prevention and response measures to suit their unique needs, so long as these measures provide equivalent protection to those measures specified in the rule. It should be noted that much of the material presented here was taken from an EPA reference written for its inspectors. This document, which is referenced throughout this course, is free for download and is recommended for anyone needing periodic guidance to help ensure SPCC compliance. In addition to this guidance, I've relied on my personal experience in developing SPCC plans for all types of facilities, including small businesses having a few oil containers, electric utilities with hundreds of SPCC regulated transformers, facilities with over 1 million gallons oil storage requiring, in addition to SPCC, a facility response plan, and inclusion of the SPCC requirements into EPA's integrated contingency plan model that can be used not only for SPCC plan compliance, but also compliance with several other programs, all written into one document. So let's start this discussion with, what is the SPCC rule? SPCC is an Environmental Protection Agency program that is authorized by the Clean Water Act. The SPCC regulation is found specifically at Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 112, or simply 40 CFR Part 112. This regulation was initially published in 1973 and has been modified substantially since that time. What is the SPCC plan? The SPCC rule establishes requirements to prepare and implement written SPCC plans. The purpose of the plan is to form a comprehensive oil spill prevention program that minimizes the potential for discharges. The plan must address all relevant spill prevention, control, and countermeasures necessary at the specific facility. SPCC plans complement existing laws, regulations, rules, standards, and policies pertaining to safety, fire prevention, and oil pollution prevention. Lastly, do states have SPCC rules? The answer is yes. Although SPCC is a federal regulation, its requirements often intersect with state regulations and even local ordinances. For example, in Florida, the Department of Environmental Protection enforces rules for above-ground storage tanks, and many of those tanks are also SPCC regulated. Even beyond this, some states, such as New Jersey, New York, and others, have developed their own SPCC statutes, which take the federal requirements and add to them. State requirements must be considered when developing an SPCC plan. Here's a quick background on the SPCC rule history. The initial SPCC rule was promulgated in 1973 to implement the requirements of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which directed the President to issue regulations for preventing discharges of oil and hazardous substances from vessels and facilities. This rule laid the foundation for SPCC, but it had weaknesses. An example was the frequent use of the word should, making it seem more like a guideline than a strict set of mandatory requirements. After the initial rule was published, there were several high-profile oil spill disasters that occurred, such as the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska's Prince William Sound in 1989 that led to a huge public outcry. These spills were the catalyst that led to the creation of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which resulted in the revisions to the SPCC rule we have today. The revised SPCC rules in 2002 strengthened the language of the initial rule from should to shall, removing that vagueness. It specified certain SPCC elements such as facility diagrams, and it required employee training, tank integrity testing, and other new program components. Oil field equipment was added to the scope, such as transformers and generators, which cast a much wider net over the regulated community. Today, it is estimated that there are well over 500,000 facilities subject to the SPCC regulation. The changes to the 2002 SPCC rule were so impactful that it took about 7 years of compliance deadline extensions before the regulated community was held fully accountable for SPCC compliance. The agenda for this course is as follows. First, key SPCC terms and concepts, particularly those needed to help identify a potentially regulated facility. Second, a discussion of how to calculate the amount of oil at a specific facility. Next, a discussion of how a reasonable determination is made regarding the potential for a facility to cause a harmful discharge to navigable water. You'll know after this discussion why the word reasonable here is put in quotation marks. Lastly, this course will end with a brief discussion on the SPCC plan options. A more thorough discussion will be presented in the next course, Part 2 of this SPCC series. This section will cover some of the terms and concepts that are foundational to understanding SPCC applicability. Shown here is a flowchart that was provided in the guidance to help determine whether the SPCC rule applies. It involves a series of determinations. The first determination is whether the facility or any part of the facility is considered non-transportation related. You know that when you have a double hyphenated word, you'll have to look up that definition. In addition, the idea that a facility can be subdivided into parts is a little confusing. The next determination is whether the facility is engaged in various regulated activities. Many of these activities relate to oil production, but most the key activities to consider are storing, using, and consuming, which is very common. Next, you must determine if the facility can reasonably be expected to discharge oil in harmful quantities to navigable waters. This statement is full of SPCC-related definitions that must be understood to make this determination. Lastly, if you've made it this far, you must calculate how much oil you have to see if the facility exceeds the threshold quantities of 1,320 gallons of oil in above-ground containers or 42,000 gallons underground. If either of those quantities are exceeded, congratulations, it looks like you're regulated under SPCC. Taking the EPA decision chart, you can distill this question of applicability into a single question as follows. Can the oil-containing non-transportation related facility that is involved in regulated activities with an oil capacity totaling more than 1,320 gallons for an above-ground tank or 42,000 gallons for underground, due to its location, reasonably be expected to discharge oil in harmful quantities to navigable waters or adjoining shorelines? The words highlighted in red are those words that are unique to SPCC and require an accurate explanation to answer the question. You simply cannot use Webster's Dictionary to interpret this question. The following sections will explain these terms and concepts and provide examples for clarity. This section will address the first two determinations from the EPA flowchart to help answer the question, is the facility non-transportation related and engaged in regulated activities? The key terms and concepts to be covered in the slides that follow include the definition of oil, regulated activities, definition of a facility, including defining the facility boundaries, oil container and the different types of containers, the definition of harmful discharge of oil, and lastly, the definition of navigable water. Under SPCC, oil means oil of any kind or in any form. This definition includes what you would expect, namely petroleum-based oils such as diesel fuel, lubricants, and mineral oils. The rule also applies to asphalt derivatives such as emulsions, but not hot mix asphalt mixed with aggregate. The definition includes non-petroleum derived oils such as pine oils and silicon fluids. The definition includes synthetic fluids such as heat transfer fluids, hydraulic fluids, transmission fluids, and other synthetic oils. In response to the Edible Oil Regulatory Reform Act of 1995, vegetable oils and animal fats were added to the definition. Examples of vegetable oils include corn oil, coconut oil, and peanut oil. Animal-derived oils include fish oil, lard, and tallow. Biodiesel and biodiesel blends are regulated. Oil mixtures are included, such as oil and water or oil mixed with hazardous waste. If the mixture does not contain oil, it is not SPCC but could be regulated under a different EPA program. There is some nuance involved, so be careful. For example, natural gas and liquid petroleum gas is exempt from the definition. However, natural gas liquid condensate is covered by the rule. All this is to say, if you have a liquid related to any of these categories, you might be covered by SPCC. If in doubt, consult the EPA's SPCC Guidance Manual. The activities that trigger SPCC coverage are broken out here into two categories. First, there are those activities that relate to oil production and include such things as drilling, producing, gathering, processing, and refining. As you might guess, the ways in which the SPCC rules apply to oil production are numerous and complex. A thorough analysis of oil production and SPCC are beyond the scope of this course. Then there are those activities that apply to most facilities with oil. Those activities are storing, transferring, distributing, using, and consuming. There is not a lot of confusion involved here. If you have oil at your site, you are likely engaged in one or more of these activities. Now let's discuss one of the most critical terms, facility. It's easy to think of a facility as being a site, like an address. That is not correct. A single site might have several facilities for SPCC determination. The definition of facility governs the overall applicability under SPCC. For example, how you define a facility determines how you calculate the amount of oil at that facility. Also, the location of a facility is used to judge whether you have the potential to discharge oil to a navigable water. One of the most important characteristics of a facility is its boundary. The boundary or extent of a facility depends on site-specific circumstances. Factors that may be considered relevant in delineating the boundaries of a facility include, but are not limited to, the following: ownership, management, and operation of buildings, structures, and equipment, similarity in functions, operations, or activities, adjacency, and lastly, shared drainage pathways, that is, same receiving water bodies. The facility owner-operator, or the professional engineer acting on their behalf, must make a judgment as to what constitutes a facility. The next couple of slides illustrate this concept of setting the boundaries for a facility. This boundary concept is best explained by example, one taken from EPA's guidance manual. Let's say a farmer has one central fueling location and 10 separate tracts of land. The central fueling location has several oil containers with an aggregate storage capacity of 5,000 U.S. gallons for diesel fuel, gasoline, and hydraulic lubrication oils. Each tract has one 1,000-gallon above-ground container of diesel fuel used for fueling only the equipment operated on the tract. The tracts are located such that the containers are each several miles from each other. Each tract produces various types of crops, and thus the equipment is operated seasonally according to the crop type and irrigation needs. What might be the determination of facility boundaries in this situation? Given the distance between containers and the clear distinction between the operations that they support, each tract in the central fueling location can be considered a separate facility for purposes of calculating oil storage capacity and determining the applicability of the SPCC rule. In this example, each tract does not individually meet the above-ground storage capacity threshold for applicability of the SPCC rule. That is, it doesn't exceed 1,320 gallons. Therefore, no SPCC plan is required for these tracts. Only the central fueling at 5,000 gallons exceeds the threshold. However, the farmer might choose to include the other diesel containers to provide oil prevention measures for the entire site. Let's discuss just a few other examples because this concept of facility boundary is so important. Let's say you have first 10 drums of lube oil in a shed and a 1,000-gallon equipment above-ground tank used for maintenance, located 50 yards away. Is this a single boundary? It's likely. Why? Because they are located close together, that is, adjacent. They have the same owner, the same maintenance operation, and likely have similar drainage patterns. Let's say you have equipment reservoirs in a powerhouse totaling 2,500 gallons aggregate. Single boundary? Likely. Again, because of the same location, same function, probably the same operators, in the same indoor drainage areas. What about a 1,000-gallon diesel tank for equipment at a mine site, and then you have a 1,200-gallon diesel tank at another mine site a mile away? Is this a single boundary for a facility? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe because you have the same owners, the same function, and the same activity being performed. However, maybe not, because there is a large distance between them and they possibly impact different navigable waters. Lastly, at a site, you have 10 drums of lube oil in a shed, and you also have a 1,000-gallon diesel for a generator for admin located 1,000 yards away. In this case, do you have a single boundary? This is unlikely, because at each location you have different types of oil used for different functions. You probably have different managers over each location, and they're separated by distance. A word of caution on defining facility boundaries. EPA says that an owner or operator may not characterize a facility boundary to avoid applicability of the rule. The issue of EPA looking at your boundaries might come up if you were to report an oil spill and EPA starts questioning why you do not have an SPCC plan. Examples of trying to avoid regulation might include the following. You claim to have similar facilities that are separate, but they are actually located adjacent or in close proximity to one another. You determine that oils in the same location are not counted together because they are different products coming from different suppliers. Or finally, you claim that similar facilities drain to different stormwater areas on the site, but actually these areas eventually drain to the same drainage ditches and impact the same water body. These examples demonstrate the need for a qualified person to make the judgment as to what facilities are present. Facilities regulated under 40 CFR Part 112 are divided into three categories: transportation-related facilities, non-transportation-related facilities, and complexes. A complex means a facility that has both transportation-related and non-transportation-related components and is therefore subject to more than one federal agency. A memorandum of understanding between EPA and the Department of Transportation, or DOT, clarifies the types of facilities, activities, equipment, and vessels that fall under the terms transportation-related onshore and offshore facilities and non-transportation-related onshore and offshore facilities. DOT-regulated transportation facilities are exempt from SPCC. Examples of DOT-regulated facilities include highway vehicles and railroad cars used for oil transport, interstate and intrastate piping systems, and terminal facilities such as transfer hoses and loading arms used to transfer oil in bulk to vessels. Examples of non-transportation related facilities that come under SPCC include fixed or mobile onshore and offshore facilities, facilities that use and store oil, loading racks, transfer hoses used to transfer oil in bulk to and from highway vehicles and railroad cars, and lastly, highway vehicles, railroad cars, and pipelines used to transfer oil exclusively within the confines of a non-transportation related facility, such as a fueling vehicle used exclusively at an airport. The last example is interesting. If a tanker truck that looks like a tanker truck you see on public highways never leaves a site except to refuel, such as a truck at an airport, it comes under SPCC. SPCC would address the potential of a discharge from this truck. A similar example is the case of a railroad car that typically is used to transport oil and is DOT regulated. But if that railroad car is parked at a site and used for storage of oil for a process, then the railroad car comes under SPCC. The EPA guidance gives a thorough discussion of the various scenarios involving tank trucks and other equipment that can store and transfer oil. Now that we've covered the steps to identify a facility, it's time to focus on how to sum up the capacity of oil being stored at that facility. The questions that must be answered are, is the total aggregate capacity of above-ground oil storage containers greater than 1,320 gallons of oil? Or is the total aggregate capacity of completely buried storage tanks greater than 42,000 gallons of oil. The amount of oil at a facility is based on the capacity of oil storage containers. There are certain definitions that must be known in order to do this, along with SPCC rules on counting. This section will cover those terms and concepts. Knowing whether a facility is regulated depends on the amount of oil in the oil storage containers. Under SPCC, there are two basic types of oil storage containers: bulk storage containers and oil-filled equipment. Bulk storage containers means any container used to store oil. These containers are used for purposes including but not limited to the storage of oil prior to use, while being used, or prior to further distribution in commerce. Examples of bulk oil storage is drums, totes, and tanks, either above ground or underground. Oil-filled equipment is defined as equipment that includes an oil storage container or multiple containers in which the oil is present solely to support the function of the apparatus or the device. Examples of oil-filled equipment include transformers, generators, and lubricating systems. It is important to recognize the difference between these two not only to determine oil capacities at a facility, but also because some SPCC requirements governing these containers are significantly different. If you have an underground tank at your facility, it's worth fully understanding how it might be regulated. SPCC regulates completely buried tanks. This means any container completely below grade and covered with earth, sand, gravel, asphalt, or other material. Containers in vaults, bunker tanks, or partially buried tanks are considered above-ground storage containers for purposes of SPCC. This can be very significant because if a tank is not completely buried or in a vault, then the SPCC threshold drops to the above-ground tank regulated amount of 1,320 gallons rather than the 42,000 gallons amount that applies to completely buried tanks. It should be noted that completely buried tanks that are subject to the federal or state UST rules are exempt from SPCC. That is why typical gas stations are not SPCC regulated. However, any underground tank that is not regulated by a federal or state rule is in turn subject to SPCC. An example of this is a buried tank that is less than 110 gallons capacity, the cutoff for UST regulation. Another example might be an emergency spill and overflow tank that is expeditiously emptied after use. Again, this tank is not regulated under the UST rules, and therefore it is subject to SPCC. The SPCC Guidance Manual has a list of completely buried tanks that are exempt from the UST rules and therefore might be considered for SPCC. There are certain SPCC rules that govern how you count the oil at a particular facility. Number one, you need to identify what oil storage containers are present at a facility that are subject to SPCC. That is, they are not exempt or those containers are not permanently closed. Now, permanently closed means that the tank meets the conditions for closed as defined in the SPCC rule. It involves much more than just claiming that you are no longer using the tank, even if you empty that tank of its contents. Number two, consider every container with a shell capacity of 55 gallons or more. Shell capacity refers to the maximum volume a storage container can hold, measured in gallons. In other words, don't count the amount in the container or typically kept in the container. Count the maximum, the shell capacity. Note that the SPCC guidance provides information on how a container's shell capacity can be re-rated to reduce the volume needed to be counted. Number three, add the total amount of the facility's oil to see if the above-ground capacity is greater than 1,320 gallons or the completely buried underground capacity is greater than 42,000 gallons. So according to the rules, there are certain things that you don't have to count. First, containers less than 55 gallons do not have to be counted. As we talked about, permanently closed containers also do not have to be counted. Exempt are single-family residential heating oil tanks, tanks that are completely buried and subject to federal or state underground storage tank rules are exempt. Equipment not owned or under the control of the site owner-operator does not have to be counted. An example of this would be a transformer with oil in it that's under the control of the local electric utility. And then lastly, containers used exclusively for wastewater treatment. If you have any questions about any of these examples of what not to count, I would refer to the EPA guidance for the regional inspectors. So let's assume by now you've determined your SPCC regulated oil facilities at a site, you've identified all the oil containers and summed up their capacities, and you found that the oil capacities exceed the SPCC thresholds at one or more facilities. The last question to ask for each facility is the following. Is the facility reasonably expected to discharge oil in quantities that may be harmful to navigable waters or adjoining shorelines? Let's discuss the term harmful discharge. It is reasonable to think that a harmful discharge to navigable water is an incident involving tens, if not hundreds of gallons. However, the SPCC definition of harmful discharge is something much different. Harmful discharge is defined in 40 CFR Part 110 as a discharge that causes a sheen or discoloration on the surface of the water or adjoining shorelines, causes a sludge or emulsion to be deposited beneath the surface of the water or upon adjoining shorelines, or violates an applicable water quality standard. How much oil causes a sheen or a violation of an applicable water quality standard? Certainly not gallons, but more like quarts or even a few teaspoons. Yet, a harmful discharge requires immediate reporting to the National Response Center and most state agencies. Failure to report such a discharge may result in criminal sanctions under the Clean Water Act. You might be thinking, my boat leaves a sheen every time I start it up. The good news is that under 40 CFR Part 110, discharges of oil from a properly functioning boat engine are not determined harmful. Keep your boat in good repair and you should be okay. The SPCC definition of navigable waters is very broad. Navigable water certainly does not mean you can float a boat on it. The term has been litigated over the years, but the current SPCC rule is based on the definition used way back in 1973. The term includes waters of the United States. This is a statutory term with broad scope encompassing rivers, lakes, bays, estuaries, and other waters that are navigable or have a direct connection to navigable waters. It also includes wetlands adjacent to these waters with a continuous surface connection. It can also include intrastate lakes and ponds that are relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing. Currently, the situation is so broad that if a topographic map shows a water body, then you are reasonably safe to assume that that water body is considered a navigable water. However, this might change. In November 2025, the EPA announced a proposed rule that would clarify the definition of waters of the United States. This rule, if passed, could further narrow or clarify the scope regarding wetlands and tributaries. So stay tuned on that. So now let's consider the SPCC rules for a reasonable expectation of a harmful discharge. The rule does not define what can reasonably be expected. The owner or operator of each facility must determine the potential for a discharge from their facility. This determination must be based solely upon the consideration of geographical and locational aspects of the facility. This means that in making the determination, you should consider the location of the facility in relation to a stream, ditch, gully, or storm sewer. You should also consider the volume of the material likely to be spilled and drainage patterns and soil conditions. What you cannot consider is constructed features such as dikes, secondary containment, or other man-made structures that prevent, contain, or restrain a discharge. Incredibly, the things that are most relied on to contain an oil spill are not a part of the spill impact determination. However, you should consider man-made structures that facilitate a discharge, such as stormwater or sanitary sewer conduits, even if they lead to a publicly owned treatment works before reaching a navigable water. EPA's rationale for all this is that man-made structures can fail to contain oil, even treatment plants. Other factors to consider are heavy rainfall runoff that might occur and past discharges from the facility that reached navigable water. Because this determination relies heavily on complex judgment, it is a good idea to document this determination and what was considered in the reasonable expectation, especially if it's decided that no impact can occur. Let's discuss good sources of geographic information. Because the reasonably expected determination relies heavily on geographic factors, it's good to be aware of what information is available online and elsewhere. Google Earth is a free online tool that can be used to obtain detailed aerial imagery and maps. The Fish and Wildlife Services has an overlay for Google Earth that can be used to highlight streams, ponds, lakes, and other water bodies. The USGS Topographic Maps offers a free online service where you can obtain topographic maps that are historical and current. These maps show contours that provide insight as to which direction the runoff is taking and where the water bodies are located. Many of the county property appraisal departments offer a variety of maps that can provide details on parcels in the county along with current identification of structures. Lastly, there are proprietary software tools that can be used for SPCC determination purposes. Returning to the question that was asked earlier in this presentation, can the oil-containing non-transportation related facility that is involved in regulated activities with an oil capacity totaling more than 1,320 gallons AST or 42,000 gallons UST, due to its location, reasonably be expected to discharge oil in harmful quantities to navigable waters or adjoining shorelines? If based on a good understanding of the terms and concepts highlighted in this question, if the answer is yes, then you need to develop and implement an SPCC plan. However, if the answer is no, given the complexities involved, it's a good idea to have documentation of how that decision was made in case questions are asked in the future. I'll leave this discussion of applicability with a quick review. According to the SPCC rule, this is oil, this is an oil container, this is likely a navigable water, this is considered non-transportation related activity at an airport. This is an above-ground oil storage tank. And this is likely an oil release that requires immediate reporting to the National Response Center. If you are tracking on all these definitions, then you are now equipped to consider how the SPCC rule applies to your facility. To finish out this course, I want to briefly discuss some of the SPCC options available and the criteria that triggers the specific plan. A more thorough discussion of this subject will be presented in the next video, part 2 of this series. The previous slides described the full SPCC plan required by 40 CFR 112 that, among other things, requires that specified elements be included in the plan and that it is certified by a professional engineer. Changes to the SPCC rule allowed for tiered versions of the full plan based on storage capacity, container size, and spill history. A notable feature of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 plans is that the owner-operator can self-certify rather than having to use a PE. The applicable threshold for qualified facilities, meaning qualified for either Tier 1 or Tier 2, is the following. The aggregate oil storage capacity is less than 10,000 gallons. The spill history over the last 3 years is below certain limits, such as less than 2 42-gallon or less spills occurring within a 12-month period. The difference between a Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that the Tier 2 facility has an individual container over 5,000 gallons capacity. For the Tier 1 plan, EPA has prepared a template that can be filled out and signed. The Tier 2 plan requires all of the elements of a full plan. However, both plans allow self-certification by a knowledgeable owner-operator instead of a PE. Here's the catch. The person signing must be familiar with the SPCC requirements enough to know that the plan is adequate to address the facility's spill risk. The full plan has been discussed and is the one most common. However, there is also a plan referred to as the multi-site SPCC plan. This plan format is useful where numerous facilities are similar in function and spill risk. A general plan can be written to cover all the facilities with site-specific information such as location and site oil capacities placed in appendices. This plan is most useful for an electric utility with dozens or even hundreds of substations that can benefit from a single plan instead of a plan written for each substation.
This completes this Part 1 presentation focused on SPCC applicability. I hope that you received some valuable takeaways from this course, and you will plan on attending the Part 2 discussion of plan options. In Part 2, I will also cover the facility response plan that is part of the SPCC rule but applies to much larger sites, and the EPA Integrated Contingency Plan guidance that allows companies to weave several EPA and even OSHA compliance plans into a single document. Until then, you can see my contact information on the last slide. I encourage you to visit my website to see the services I offer, and if interested, please fill out a form or send me an email to discuss your concerns. I look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, please have a great day.